This is the greatest financial experiment in human history, and most people don't even realize they're living inside it. Today, global debt, public, private, corporate, and household, has grown to levels no civilization has ever carried before. Governments spend trillions as if it were nothing. Central banks create money with a few keystrokes. Families sign 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. And yet we still talk about debt as if it were harmless, normal, and permanent. The truth is far more unsettling. Throughout history, debt has always been a tool of power, a mechanism of control, and a time bomb waiting for the right spark. The real question isn't whether this mountain of global debt will trigger a crisis, but when and who will pay the price when the system resets. To understand that, we must go back to the origins of debt itself. The history of debt begins with the history of civilization. The first clay tablets found in Mesopotamia were not poetry or philosophy. They were ledgers, records of who owed what, how much grain, how many cattle. In those early societies, debt wasn't just an economic tool, it was sacred. Priests and kings supervised debts, enforced them, and when the social fabric began to tear, they sometimes erased them in sweeping jubilees, resetting the system to save society from collapse. Those ancient rulers understood something modern leaders pretend to forget. You cannot bind an entire population with obligations forever. A system built on endless debt will always crack. As centuries passed, the nature of debt evolved. Grain and livestock gave way to gold and credit. In Renaissance Europe, banking families like the Medici financed wars, cathedrals, and empires. And a harsh truth became clear. Even an empire overflowing with gold can drown in debt when ambition outpaces reality. Spain, despite the silver pouring in from the New World, went bankrupt 4 times in the 16th century. Debt was no longer merely personal, it became geopolitical, fueling wars, toppling dynasties, and redrawing maps. The 20th century brought the Great Explosion. After the First World War, nations carried debts so enormous that repayment became impossible. Germany was crushed under the weight of reparations, and when the burden became unbearable, its economy collapsed into the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, people pushing wheelbarrows of paper marks to buy bread. The scars of that crisis shaped the politics that led to the next war. Debt was not just a number, it was the fuel of chaos. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the modern financial order was engineered. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold, anchored the system. The dollar was tied to gold, and every other currency tied itself to the dollar. In theory, it meant stability. In reality, it meant dependence. Every nation's debt, every bond, every financial calculation suddenly rested on the discipline of the United States. By the 1960s, America's spending from the Vietnam War to domestic programs outpaced its gold reserves. Other nations noticed and started demanding gold in exchange for dollars. And in 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. Debt was now unchained, unlimited, governed only by trust. That moment was a silent revolution. Once money was no longer tied to anything real, central banks discovered they could manipulate interest rates to steer economies. When growth slowed, rates were cut to encourage borrowing. When crises emerged, more debt was issued to fill the cracks. Each rescue required more leverage than the last. Developing nations borrowed from Western banks until the Latin American debt crisis struck. The pattern was set: use debt to chase prosperity. then collapse under its weight. Then came 2008. It wasn't only a housing crisis, it was a collapse of debt stacked upon debt. Mortgages packaged into securities, sold to investors, insured with derivatives, amplified by extreme leverage. When the structure failed, it brought down banks, pensions, and entire economies. Governments stepped in with trillions. And yet, the bitter truth was this: those who borrowed recklessly were saved. Ordinary people paid the price. Over the last 20 years, global debt has tripled, surpassing $300 trillion, nearly 4 times the size of the world economy. Japan now carries public debt over 200% of its GDP. The United States adds trillions in deficits every year. Emerging nations borrow in foreign currencies, leaving them exposed to sudden collapse. The entire system depends on the illusion that debt can expand forever without consequences.